I'm Kurt Munz, and this is joint work with Vicky Morwitz. In this presentation, we will explore how a marketer's presentation of information affects consumer choices. Specifically, we'll compare how a consumer chooses when product options are described in auditory speech compared to the same descriptions presented visually in writing. This isn't an entirely new consumer phenomenon. For example, restaurant diners can have a list of specials described to them. But the relevance of this phenomenon became more prominent with the widespread consumer adoption of voice speakers. These devices, where people interact with AI digital assistants using their voice, have become widespread. And voice assistants are now also common in mobile phones and smartwatches, for example with Siri, and in cars and televisions. Of particular relevance for this discussion is the idea of voice shopping, where people can shop by voice using these voice assistants. As you can see, there's a sizable volume of shopping being conducted by voice, and some have forecast continued growth in this area. However, as I'm sure many of you are aware, voice shopping has not taken off with the speed and ubiquity that was initially forecast. For example, a report in The Information cited data within Amazon that suggested that 98% of Amazon Alexa voice speaker owners never used the device to make a purchase, and of those who did, 9 out of 10 used it only to make a single purchase. So this might suggest that there is something holding consumers back from fully embracing voice commerce. One of the goals of this presentation will be to understand why voice shopping is so lousy, so to speak, and to suggest a way to improve the customer experience. As the title suggests, we propose that making decisions when options are presented as speech can be harder for consumers than when they are presented as text. And understanding the root of this difficulty can help us to suggest a remedy. So let me start off by saying that it's not obvious that listening to speech is inherently harder than reading. In fact, some have claimed that listening to auditory information is generally easier than reading text. Developmental psychologists, for example, note that reading must be explicitly taught to children, whereas the ability to understand speech occurs as a normal part of development earlier in a child's life and without formal training. On a more concrete level, anyone who has hesitated to read subtitles in a foreign language film may also appreciate the comparative ease of processing auditory dialogue. For proficient readers, however, differences in processing difficulty between text and speech may be minimal. For example, experiments in psychology suggest that comprehension of written text in the form of books and auditory text in the form of audiobooks can often be quite similar, suggesting that the tasks may also be quite similar in terms of difficulty. On the other hand, designers of voice-based interfaces used in telephone systems have consistently advocated for simple interfaces that minimize cognitive challenges. This implies that understanding speech may be a challenge in some circumstances. So the question probably is not if speech is harder to process than text, but rather when. And we thought that one task that might be harder when listening is making comparisons, a particularly important task in shopping. So why would this be the case? So comparing involves using memory. In order to compare the two options on the features, as in this example, one must remember the values for each feature in order to compare them. For text and writing, the information remains visible and can be easily reread when necessary. And so for the visual mode, it can be considered a form of memory offloading. And we know from past literature that if there's an increased memory load, as there is with speech, it should make the task a more difficult task. So what are the consequences of this? One consequence could be that consumers will mistake the difficulty of the task for their own indecision. In this case, past research suggests that they would be less likely to make a purchase now, instead choosing to defer their choice to a later time. Recent literature also suggests that consumers may be more likely to adhere to spoken recommendations compared to those made in writing. The authors suggested that the ephemeral nature of speech creates a sense of urgency, which in turn prompts a need for closure. The fastest road to that closure is to accept the recommendation. So this is possible, of course, but here we suggest that the phenomenon like that one could also arise from difficulty making comparisons. So to make that prediction, we consider evaluability theory, which considers differences in consumer evaluations when making comparisons versus when not doing so. So in this theory, some information is easy to understand on its own, high evaluability information it's called, while other information is better understood in the choice context by making comparisons. This is called low evaluability information. In this example, a recommendation can be easily understood. It is high evaluability. As a counterexample, for most people, the number of nits of brightness is itself somewhat meaningless, but we can easily see that 500 nits is better than 300 nits, and so we can consider this information low evaluability. If when listening to speech, consumers have difficulty comparing, it should be harder for them to use low evaluability information in their judgment decision making, and thus they should be more likely to rely on high evaluability information like recommendations for their judgment decision making. Okay, so we demonstrate these effects across 6 experiments, but for the sake of time, I am only going to discuss 3. I'm going to skip the main effects so that we can focus on the when question, which I think is more interesting. So when is processing auditory speech more consequential for consumers? So specifically in this experiment, we're going to examine the role of making comparisons. So this experiment has 2 factors. The first is mode. A description of a target multivitamin was either read aloud in a male-sounding Google Assistant voice, or instead the same text was presented on the computer screen for participants to read. So we crossed that factor, that mode factor, with a factor manipulating comparison. Before hearing or reading the description of the target multivitamin used as the stimulus, participants were either informed about a benchmark, a doctor-recommended minimum effective dose for the multivitamin, or they were not. Okay, so in the benchmark condition only, participants saw this text. And so this text was always presented visually. Those that were not in the benchmark condition never saw any text like this. And then all participants saw this text, which was either presented on the screen as text or spoken aloud in speech, depending on condition. And so comparing this to the benchmarks, we can see that this exceeds the doctor-recommended minimum effective doses. So this design helps us also to disentangle the past work on speech-based recommendations from our proposed account. If it's the case that people are more likely to adhere to spoken versus written recommendations, we should see a main effect such that this multivitamin is rated more favorably for speech, since you can see here the target vitamin is recommended. In contrast, if comparing is a more difficult task when listening to speech, we should see a lower evaluation for the speech condition, but only when making comparisons, since it'll be difficult to compare this multivitamin to the benchmark and determine that it does indeed satisfy the minimum doses. Okay, and so the latter pattern is what we observed. That is, there was no positive main effect of listening to speech. Instead, there was an interaction such that when not making comparisons, participants rated the target multivitamin similarly regardless of mode. However, when comparing to a benchmark, participants rated the target multivitamin less favorably when listening compared to reading. This suggests that they were less effective in discerning that the target multivitamin exceeded the minimum thresholds. Okay, so that last experiment showed that differences between text and speech occurred only when making comparisons. And this experiment extends that idea further. So our theory suggests that it's not just recommendations which should carry more impact for listeners over readers. It should be any information that is high in evaluability. So to test this idea, we tested Chris Shee's original stimuli of music dictionaries. We took his original 3 conditions where participants either considered 2 options within subjects or only one of the 2 options between subjects, and we crossed them with a manipulation of mode, text versus speech. So the stimuli were closely adapted from the original paper by Shee. Dictionary S on the left was expected to be preferred in separate evaluation, while Dictionary J was expected to be preferred in joint evaluation. Most people don't really know how many entries there should be in a music dictionary. So is 10,000 many or few? I'm not sure, but I can easily see that 20,000 is better than 10,000. And so this is a good example of information that we can say is low in evaluability. In contrast, I can easily understand what like new means without making any comparisons. So this is high evaluability information, the type that dominates separate evaluation. So one difference from the original paper was that for the visual text joint condition, the 2 options were presented sequentially, so on one screen after another. So this equates the procedure with the auditory speech joint evaluation condition, as auditory speech can only be described one at a time, which means sequentially. Okay, and so these are the results. We can see that differences between listening and reading emerged only when consumers compared items in joint evaluation. So that's these left 4 bars. So you can see that by taking a look here at the joint evaluation conditions. We can see that the relative pattern for listening to speech is different than the relative pattern for reading text. Whereas if we consider the separate evaluation conditions, there were not differences in terms of the relative appreciation of either one. So in the original paper by Shi, what they found was that in separate evaluation, the S dictionary in the gray bars here should be favored, and that's exactly what was found. However, in joint evaluation, the original theory predicted a kind of a crossover. The J dictionary should be favored. So we saw directions consistent with that, but not as strong as reported in the original paper. And I think that's because our procedure differed. We had participants view these dictionaries sequentially. Now we can see for the listening to speech conditions, in separate evaluation, they were evaluated similarly compared to the reading text, and that relative pattern persisted in joint evaluation. So there was no joint separate difference compared to the reading condition. Okay, so this is evidence that even in joint evaluation mode, consumers processing auditory information tend to favor the high evaluability information. So finally, we demonstrate how a manager can use this research. If the effects of difficulty are due to comparing options described by speech, as we have proposed, making comparison easier should improve sales in the speech mode when the target is a good one. So to test this idea, we conducted an experiment in a field setting. We recruited participants to participate using the voice speakers they already had in their homes. So to accomplish this, we wrote a skill for Alexa devices. A skill is on Alexa is analogous to an app on a smartphone. We made our skill available on all Alexa devices in the United States. We recruited online participants who owned an Alexa device. We then asked them to say a particular phrase to their Alexa to launch the skill and start the study. After they input a code we gave them, the entire study was then conducted on the Alexa device. The experiment was about a product reorder scenario. So participants in the scenario attempted to reorder a past purchase, but the exact product they ordered previously was unavailable. We asked participants if they wanted to order a substitute product. And you can see that the 2 products on the screen. So we contrasted 2 formats for presenting the options. The first simply described the product ordered last time and the product currently available in the way you see it here. We'll call this the standard format. In a study I didn't show you earlier, we demonstrated that in this exact scenario, which involves comparing the current offer to the past purchase, there was lower sales in the speech mode compared to the text mode. So we contrasted the format we just saw, the standard format, against this relative format. And we predicted that this relative format would improve sales in the speech mode. That is, for each product attribute, we explicitly stated how it compared to the past order, and we hope that this would make comparing easier and improve sales. And this is exactly the pattern that we found. So for spoken options, remember there was no text condition here because it was all conducted on Alexa. This relative format did increase the percent that were willing to order that substitute product. So in conclusion, differences in difficulty between listening to speech and reading text emerged specifically when consumers made comparisons. This led listeners to defer more often, which I didn't actually show you, but take my word for it, and to rely on high validity information to guide their judgments and decisions, which is what I focused on today. We also demonstrated a format for presenting information that makes comparing easier and can improve sales in the voice modality. So thanks for listening.